Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Institute of Politics, the State of Voting Rights in America. I'm Steve Edwards, the Executive Director of the Institute, and pleased to see all of you here tonight for what promises to be a great conversation, a very timely conversation. As many of you know who've been to our programs before, our core mission here at the Institute is to strengthen American democracy and cultivate the next generation of political leaders. And events like these are absolutely at the heart of that, where we aim to elevate and expand the discourse around politics, bringing thought leaders together to share their insights and perspectives. Tonight's event's no exception. It's actually part of a broader series of events that we've been doing over the course of the spring quarter, focused on voting rights in a historical context. We have had a number of events here on campus. Some of you may have participated in them, including a couple of workshops earlier this week with participants in the Freedom Summer Campaign in 1964 in Mississippi. There was also a major event with Danny Glover and a film screening looking at the history of these events in 1964. Today's conversation really brings that history forward to the issues that are guiding us today, politically and legally. I want to thank those who've partnered with us in this series, including Tracy Matthews and the staff at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, Professor Charles Payne here at SSA, who really brought all of us together in the first place to begin this conversation, and Adam Green, professor in the Division of Social Sciences as well. This is also, in some respects, the culmination of a three-part series we've done looking at the state of democracy in the United States, looking at structural issues. It's the third in a series that we call the Joyce Democracy Forum, and special thanks goes to George Chung and the staff at the Joyce Foundation who funded that particular series, which culminates tonight in our voting rights conversation. On Monday, we will actually have, a quick plug for this, a day-long symposium looking at election administration. There was earlier this year the release of a Presidential Election Commission report led by Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsberg, who were looking at the way elections are run in the United States, making a series of recommendations on how to prevent hanging chads and a whole series of other things that have been far too commonplace in American elections in recent years. Those two and 25 other experts will be with us downtown for the day. You can sign up to participate at that symposium, which is free and open to the public, after our event over at that table there. We encourage all of you to be here. So without further ado, let me stop there and have you join me in welcoming to the stage somebody who couldn't be a more fitting introducer of tonight's event. Clarence Oko is a fourth year at the college. He's somebody who's been very active on campus and at the IOP as a member of our student executive board. He's a past president of the Organization of Black Students. He's also been involved with the Dean's Advisory Council, where he's been chair, and a number of other organizations. He is writing, in fact, recently turned in his BA thesis on this very topic tonight. So please join me in welcoming Clarence Oko. Clarence?
All righty. Good evening, everyone. And on behalf of the Institute of Politics, once again, welcome to this evening's event, the State of Voting Rights in America. As we approach the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer and celebrating of 50 years since the March on Washington and 150 years since the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, audiences are gathering around this campus and throughout the country to critically ask questions of ourselves about what and where do the projects of emancipation and full citizenship stand in the United States in the 21st century. President Obama intervened in this conversation in front of an audience at the National Action Network in New York City, stating that, quote, "The right to vote is threatened today in a way that it has not been since the Voting Rights Act became law nearly 5 decades ago." Set against the backdrop of states engaging in a variety of changes in their voting laws, including the elimination of early voting and same-day registration, as well as the implementation of voter identification requirements and periodic voter roll purges, do the words of President Obama ring true? Or, in fact, are these measures necessary to maintain the integrity of our elections? The Institute of Politics is proud to welcome a panel of leading experts, analysts, and advocates to weigh in on this question and many more. Moderating this evening's panel is Jeffrey Toobin, a staff writer at The New Yorker and the senior legal analyst for CNN. He is the author of several written works, including his most recent, The Nine, Inside the Secret World of the Supreme Court. Joining Mr. Toobin is Tanya Clayhouse, the director of the Public Policy Department for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law. Roger Clegg, President and General Counsel for the Center for Equal Opportunity and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Reagan and Bush administrations. Richard Hassan, Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and writer of the Election Law blog. And Myrna Perez, Deputy Director for the Democracy Project at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Hello, everyone. I'm the moderator, which means if I do my job well, you'll hear very little from me and a great deal from our panelists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each panelist one provocative and inflammatory question and just give them a chance to talk, and then we'll sort of mix it up, and then, of course, we'll take your questions. So, Tanya, you need to, as a result of these new laws, you need a photo ID to vote in a lot of places. So what? You need a photo ID to cash a check, to get on a plane. What's the big deal about a photo ID requirement to vote?
Wow, I've never heard that question before. So, you know, you're right. There are many places and many times that people need ID, but we're not talking about going to the movies. We're not talking about trying to get on an airplane. We're not talking about non-fundamental rights. We're talking about the right to vote, which is kind of, it undergirds our democracy. We're talking about a right that has been challenged, that has been, fought for and bled for throughout the years by many of our forefathers, and it's something that should not be challenged, should not be encumbered, and so this is when we talk about providing photo identification, it's not simply about attesting to who you are, because we agree, particularly at the Lawyers Committee, that we want to protect the right to vote, and you can do that in many ways, and ensuring that somebody is who they are can be done by providing your voter registration card. Isn't that why we get one? You don't have to provide additional, very specific identification that was specifically created or identified, delineated by certain state legislators in order to vote. That is not how our democracy should work. You should not have to go out and get a gun license in Texas when you're a student, because that's what you had to provide, or you were allowed to provide, versus your student ID. You should not have to go get specific type of identification. So that's what we're talking about. It's not about providing ID or attesting to who you are, because there's many ways to do that. And I think that this is something that has to be fully understood, that not everybody, particularly many communities of color, people with disabilities, the elderly, people like myself who have 4 names, don't necessarily have the specific type of ID that is being requested. And it can be very challenging, and not only challenging to get through transportation costs, but also trying to find the ID to get the ID. So we're talking about a lot of steps that have to be taken in order to simply go and cast your ballot, which has been a protected right in this country, should maintain to be a protected right, and it is fundamental to ensuring that we all have a voice in this democracy.
Okay, Roger, forget all these people are here. Let's just talk, the two of us. You know there's no such thing as a voter fraud problem in this country. This is all just an attempt to disenfranchise black people and poor people, right? I mean, that's all that's really been going on since 2010, right? Am I right about that?
Well, frankly, Jeffrey, no, that is not true. Let me say that I think that it's good that we're having this conversation, because I really think that we ought to give a lot of credit to both sides for their motives in this. I mean, I don't think that there's anything terribly mysterious going on here. I think that, Democrats, liberals sincerely want to make sure that no legitimate voter is kept or even discouraged from voting. I think that's a noble sentiment and a noble goal. I think that Republicans, conservatives, want to make sure that elections are not stolen through people voting who are not authorized to vote or voting more than once. I don't think that that is something that's imaginary. That's happened in the past. It can happen again. And I think that wanting to keep that from happening is not ignoble. It's also a noble thing to want done. That's what's going on here. Now, it's true that neither side, I think, is oblivious to the partisan angle to this. I think that Democrats, liberals, know that the people who are most likely to be kept or discouraged from voting by different ballot integrity measures are likely to vote for them. And I think that Republicans believe that when elections are stolen, they're more likely to be stolen from them. So there is a partisan angle to this, but I think that, fundamentally, both sides have legitimate interests, and all that has to be done is, to work out an appropriate means of honoring both interests, and I think that that can be done. And I think that what's at stake here is important, but to equate this dispute with what was at stake 50 years ago, when you could be killed, literally, for trying to get black people to vote, is ridiculous. That's not what's at stake here.
Okay, Merda. Let's talk about the Supreme Court a little bit. Let's talk about the Shelby County decision.
Sure.
Clarence, from Shelby County, so we have a local expert here. Supreme Court said in simple terms that the formula for deciding which counties in the United States that are covered by the Voting Rights Act, that have to submit their electoral changes to the process known as pre-clearance, basically the counties that are on permanent probation, that formula is outmoded. That 1964 statistics are obsolete. The world has changed so much so that the formula is no good anymore. Thus, pre-clearance is effectively a dead letter now. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think that's obviously a bad thing. I mean, I think it's a bad thing for a number of reasons.
Could you
Sure.
hold the microphone a little closer?
I'm trying to do that.
There you go.
One of them is what it signaled to our country. It signaled the Voting Rights Act is something we all grow up learning about. It's something that is a symbol of a national commitment to not allowing racial discrimination in the ballot box. And more importantly, it had been held up by the Supreme Court in numerous instances to be the gold standard for when Congress could appropriately act to protect against racial discrimination in voting. We all know that the 15th Amendment changed the relationship between the federal government and the states with respect to the very, very narrow issue of voting and discrimination. And in that instance, it said that Congress's power was very broad and that Congress deserved a great deal of deference. And that decision was complicated and problematic for those that study what it is that the courts do, because it didn't seem to have a great deal of coherence given the vast record that was before the court to demonstrate what Congress had gone through. which makes it very hard for folks to try and figure out what the appropriate next steps are. So from a functional standpoint, the Supreme Court decision was complicated and difficult because it didn't give us a good map forward for how is it that Congress can protect against racial discrimination and make sure that when a person steps into the ballot box, they won't be discriminated against because of the color of their skin. It was also problematic because there is contemporaneous evidence of the fact that it is still needed. I do not believe, and I vigorously dispute, the idea that Americans think that it takes fire hoses and death threats to mean that there's a problem. And I think we need to acknowledge that racial discrimination can take a lot of forms. We have grown as a country, and it cannot be that that is what is the kind of extremity that's required in order for us to decide that we as Americans are going to tolerate it. And right after the Shelby County decision, we saw states take action. And it was important to remember that some of those states, at least, there's information in the public record. There were legislators willing to say this, such that they were recorded and willing to say this in public, that they were going to go more expansive in their attempt to enact voting restrictions than they were prior to the preclearance measure. And I'm talking specifically about North Carolina. But we also saw other states immediately step into the breach, saying, now that we don't have preclearance, we're going to move forward on these laws that had been stopped. There's plenty of very good studies that suggest that the laws that passed in the wake of Shelby County coincide with particular attitudes and with particular problems, suggesting that there's still racial discrimination that exists. So yes, we have made progress. Yes, it is great for us to celebrate that progress, but we have a long way to go to make sure that our elections are free, fair, and accessible. And as Americans, we need to be vigilant. We cannot ever rest on our laurels. We cannot ever assume that we've done enough. And we always need to hold ourselves to particular standards and to particular tests to make sure that we don't have backsliding. And I would leave the students with the idea that our Constitution specifically allows for that. Remember, by the time the 15th Amendment had passed, we had already formally ended slavery. We did not allow the states to get back into the Union until they had changed their constitutions to say that they weren't going to have that kind of discrimination. But we still passed the 15th Amendment because we recognized that it was going to be dynamic. We recognized that racial discrimination was going to take different forms, and in that if we were going to meet the challenge of our day, we needed to have a mechanism for dealing with this that responded to modern times. And I think the preclearance test did that. I think it's still needed. I think history will prove that it's still needed. And I'm hopeful that we as Americans will come together and figure out a way to get a new Voting Rights Amendment Act passed such that we can make sure that Americans, regardless of the color of their skin, will have an equal and fair opportunity to participate in our elections.
Rick, all right, let me ask you a question since you're off in your ivory tower, apart from the
And in
partisan
California.
fray, and in California. We've heard the sort of the rough outlines of the partisan debate here, that this is either, these post-2010 changes are, an attempt to suppress democratic vote, an attempt to preserve the integrity of elections. I mean, that's sort of the rough outline of the partisan position. Let me ask you the factual question to the extent we know it. What has the effect been of these changes to the extent we know since 2010, 2011?
Yeah, well, I'd say that we actually have to go back a little further. I'd go back to
Okay.
2000,
Okay.
Bush versus Gore. What we saw in the post-Bush versus Gore period is a few trends. One is the amount of election litigation has more than doubled in the pre-2000 period to the post-2000 period. So people are litigating more about elections. Rules are changing, and what we're seeing, when do states change rules about elections? When there's unified government. So it's no coincidence that North Carolina acts not only after Shelby County when they're freed, but when there's a Republican legislature, Republican governor. California passes same-day voter registration when there's a Democratic governor, Democratic legislature. We have red state election law and blue state election law. So there's a number of trends that are going on. In terms of how much it matters, it's a disputed empirical question. And I think there's exaggeration on both sides in terms of the extent of things. But I do think that there's been a shift since 2010. I think you're right to point to 2010. So in the early stages of, say, the passage of voter ID laws, you go back to Indiana. Indiana's law went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court upheld that law. How much voter fraud, impersonation fraud, where people go to the polls and claim to be someone else, how much was there in the record before the Supreme Court? There were no cases, not one in Indiana. And Indiana conceded there wasn't a single one. And in fact, Justice Stevens, in his opinion, had to go back to Boss Tweed in 1868 for one example, and to a single possible impersonation fraud vote cast in a 2004 Washington State governor's election. But on the other side, the plaintiffs who litigated the Indiana case couldn't come up with a single voter who lacked ID, wanted to get ID, and couldn't vote. And so Ethan Bronner of the New York Times described the fight over voter ID as two bald men fighting over a comb. And for a while, I think that was true, but then something's changed, which is that the voter ID laws and the other laws, the package of laws that North Carolina passed, which I think of as the toughest set of voting restrictions any jurisdiction has passed since the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the laws have gotten tougher. So the kinds of, every ID law is different. The kind of ID that you need has changed. And so we had two factual findings in the last 3 weeks. A Pennsylvania judge found that its law, because the Department of Transportation couldn't get IDs into the hands of everyone that wanted them, could be disenfranchising. I think the figure was over 300,000 people. And a similar figure in Wisconsin, 300 to 400,000 people. And so we haven't seen a great effect, but it doesn't mean we won't see a great effect going forward. I think as the laws get tougher and tougher, as the forms of ID that are allowed get stricter and stricter, there could be more of an effect.
Roger, and again, at this point, everybody should just feel free to jump in, but I guess, you know, several people have mentioned what is, I think, what bothers a lot of people about these laws, that it is a cure for which there is no disease, that there is voter fraud, voter impersonation simply doesn't take place. So that's why Democrats suspect the motives of Republicans who impose these requirements, because they appear to be addressing a problem that doesn't exist, and therefore they think there must be some other motive at work. How do you react to that?
Well, I don't think it's true that this is a problem that doesn't exist. I think that it's a very specific question for different jurisdictions. It may exist more in some jurisdictions than in others. Of course, we have to acknowledge also that even if it's not a problem, it's a potential problem, that if you make it too easy to engage in voter fraud, it could happen. And of course, being able to document it isn't necessarily, if you can't show a conviction, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going on. You know, laws get broken all the time without people getting caught. If you look at, you know, our side of the spectrum, there has been a lot written and documenting the extent to which there is voter fraud. Hans von Spakovsky is somebody who has written a lot in this area, and he's, you know, written a book on it with John Fund, is a respectable journalist with Wall Street Journal, and, you know, these are not crazy people, and they have found lots of examples of real live voter fraud. They know more about this than I do. The one area that I know something about is non-citizen voting, which is also something that can be addressed through having, you know, better ballot integrity measures, and I testify before Congress about that, and that's not made up. That does happen. The Justice Department has documented that it's happened. So I don't buy the argument that this is just all crazy stuff made up.
What about that, Tanya?
Can I say something there?
Sure.
Well, I mean, I would just like to
But
take...
as long as you hold the microphone close.
Certainly. I think Roger is right to point out areas of common ground and areas that I hope we can agree on, and I would think that some of them would include things like giving election administrators the tools that they need to do their job. It means funding elections. It means making sure that we have the best technology available when we are walking to a ballot box and have to vote for a voting machine. It means making sure that our election administrators are able to use the technology that we use whenever we get to do things like vote, when we buy things online. And I think one of the things that we as a country need to ask ourselves is how much are we going to invest in our elections? And I think we will have elections that people can be more comfortable with and that will be more secure and will be and will have results in terms of integrity if we properly resource our elections. And that means looking at cost savings, cost efficient, sensible ways that allow election administrators to do their jobs. And I would like for folks, from Rogers organizations and people on that side of the aisle to make those kinds of calls, that we need to be coming together and deciding that we are not going to try and get democracy on the cheap, and that we are going to invest in our elections, and we're going to give our election administrators the tools that they need to do their job well.
And I definitely agree with what Mira has just pointed out. I think it's an excellent point about the lack of resources. I also wanted to address something that just was mentioned by Mr. Clegg, which is that we spoke about non-citizen voting and the claimed instances of voter impersonation fraud. If you go and take a look, either various studies, either you're looking at Mr. von Spakovsky or looking at those done by the Brennan Center, those done by us, those done by a variety of other organizations and individuals, one of the key points that comes across is that the problems, and even those done by the Department of Justice, looking at what happened in the elections, the majority of problems were really a function of poor election administration, which is what Myrna has spoken about, and it's not about voter impersonation fraud. In fact, providing and requiring people to show a specific form of photo ID, which we're seeing across the country, is not going to fix the claimed problems that some on the other side say exist. So if we're talking about, for example, non-citizen voting, for the most part, those that have been found, or if it wasn't intentional, it was I was signing up for a variety of services at social services and checked various boxes unknowing that this is what was going to happen, or it was, so it wasn't, and then they didn't show up to try to vote. And I think that is what's being misrepresented. So I think that with regard to the perception by many of us who, and let me be clear, it's not about simply liberals or progressives. It's about those who actually want to ensure that everybody has the right to vote. So I don't care where you are on the aisle, because voting rights should be a nonpartisan, bipartisan issue. In fact, the Voting Rights Act was passed on a bipartisan measure every time it was reauthorized. So this is not about, it should not be about partisan politics. And my point is that the reason that the perception exists that this is partisan when it comes to particularly photo ID is because the lack of real examples of voter impersonation fraud and the lack of association with the remedy of what is being put forth for photo ID, that's going to somehow fix the actual election administration problems that are occurring in this country, which we are not, which are a result of the lack of funding, which Myrna has just spoken about.
Rick.
Yeah, so let me
No,
just
hold the microphone close.
Yeah. Let me disagree with both Roger and Tanya, but agree with Myrna. So on impersonation fraud, we have some data. And Colin Powell said, how could something be both a massive problem and yet impossible to detect, right? So for my book, The Voting Wars, I tried to find a single election anywhere in the United States since 1980 where there was impersonation fraud on any kind of scale that could affect the outcome of an election. And I couldn't find a case. And I put out a challenge, somebody tell me about a case. And So the only person who came up with a case was Hans von Spakovsky. And what he came up with was, he said there was a grand jury report from Brooklyn, New York, that talked about this massive impersonation fraud taking place. And even a Democratic district attorney was the one who came forward with it. So I asked him for the grand jury report, and he wouldn't produce it. And so I asked him again, he wouldn't produce it. I wrote to the president of the Heritage Foundation. I said, you know, a good principle of data, a good principle of scholarship is that you make your data available so people can falsify it or confirm it. Silence. So I was all set to go on the Rachel Maddow show and talk about this. It's going to be my moments in the sun. And then the law librarian at UC Irvine Law School found someone in the Brooklyn DA's office who actually found the report and faxed it to us, and it didn't support what von Spakovsky said. So I disagree that he's a reputable source that we should be going to. What it showed was a lot of chicanery going on by party officials and election officials, not voters tricking election officials. My favorite story from there was party officials sneaking into the Brooklyn Board of Elections at night and during the day and going into the ceiling panels above the bathroom until they closed for the night, and then they came down and they changed voter registration cards for an expected election challenge. So that happened. But in terms of impersonation fraud, a group called News 21 went around and they asked every district attorney's office in the country, send us all your election fraud cases. And here's what they found. 10 cases of impersonation fraud from 2000 to 2012 that were prosecuted. I think it led to 7 convictions, compared to 491 cases of absentee ballot fraud. Right? So in terms of the scale, so if we're going to detect it, and there's no reason to think it would be easier to detect one rather than the other. Now, it's no surprise that impersonation fraud is not a real problem, because if I go to the polling place and I say, I'm Mirna Perez, did I say that right? Nobody's going to believe me. I'd have to get enough people to go to the polling place, claim they're someone else, hope those people aren't showing up to vote, and the people who are going to pay me to do this, right? They don't even know how I vote, as opposed to absentee ballot fraud, where you can collect the ballots and vote them yourselves. I can find elections just about every year where absentee ballot fraud has affected or potentially affected the outcome of an election. So I think impersonation fraud is a non-problem, it's an excuse. Non-citizen voting is a different problem. We do have non-citizens voting, and it's true, I agree with Tanya, that many times the non-citizens who register a vote don't know they're breaking the law, but they're still, we have real cases, it happens. Voter ID doesn't address that. Here's what we need. National voter identification card coupled with universal voter registration conducted by the federal government. And I'd like to say this is a proposal that has united Democrats and Republicans. It's united them against the proposal. The Democrats hate the ID aspect, and the Republicans hate the universal registration aspect.
It's beautiful that you can achieve bipartisanship. I also love that you got a fax. That's sort of endearing. I haven't heard a lot about faxes lately.
It was 2011.
I see. Okay, yeah, it's great. Roger, I guess, you know, the question of motive here is very, you know, ever present. And I guess this is why, you know, there was a famous moment that I don't watch MSNBC personally, but I know ran many times, where the majority leader of the Pennsylvania State Senate, right before the 2012 election, was announcing his accomplishments, and he said, you know, voter ID is done, Mitt Romney's going to win Pennsylvania, you know, the cause and effect. I mean, isn't there grounds for suspicion that Republicans seem always, at least particularly in the post-2010 era, doing things that appear to be aimed at lowering turnout in traditionally Democratic constituencies?
Well, this goes back to, you know, what I said at the outset, which is that Republicans are more concerned about elections being stolen because they feel that when elections are stolen, they are usually stolen from them. And just to take the example that you gave, that sounds very damning if what you think the Pennsylvania governor, or whoever it was, you know, had in mind was that, okay, well, this ensures that we're going to be able to keep some people from voting. It doesn't sound so damning if what he was talking about was this will keep the Democrats from stealing the election in this state.
Fair enough. And Marina, were you about to say something?
I mean, I think one thing we need to ask ourselves is how it is that we want to police our elections. I personally want trained, well-resourced election administrators, like professionals, to be the ones that are making sure that our elections have integrity, that are making sure that our rolls are clean, and that are making sure that they're conducting the investigations that we need to be doing it. I think we need to be really careful when we have third-party, self-appointed policing of the polls when they won't have the training, they won't have the skill, they won't know what sort of facts go inherent, they won't sometimes know the rules. And I think one of the things, again, that I would like to leave this audience with is the idea that if we want to have the best elections in the world, which I think we do, we need to make sure that we provide the kind of training and resources that are required to do them. And that means giving our election administrators the best kind of technology, giving them the best kind of training, making sure that they're able to hire the people that they need to do, and making sure that we make the business of running elections something that happens year-round, not something that just happens the 3 weeks right before elections, because it's hard to do anything that massive that quickly. You know, if you think about voters as customers, then election administrators have probably the largest consumer base of any other industry in the country. And if we want, as voters, to get good customer service, we need to make sure that, that we have the building blocks to do so.
Rick, let me just ask you, you mentioned Bush v. Gore earlier, and one of the paradoxes, it may be, of Bush v. Gore is that obviously, because of all the criticism of the punch card ballot and Chads and the unreliability of it, there was an effort on the part of some to modernize the equipment. But wasn't there also the recognition that how you conduct elections and what technology you use and what rules you have can have a great deal of partisan effect depending on which rules you have? Now, how have things changed? Have we modernized or have we simply politicized the process?
Yes, so though I have a punch card.
Hold the microphone close.
I have a punch card machine in my office. It was a anniversary present for my wife. She bought it from on eBay. It's a Lee County, Florida machine. She didn't buy me the Palm Beach County machine because those were $3,000, and you know she loves me, but not quite that much.
I have the Palm Beach
All
machine.
right.
I do.
She loves you more, apparently.
Well, I bought it myself, so.
So the one good piece of good news that came out of Florida is that we got rid of the very worst technology. The very worst technology was the punch card machines and the lever machines in New York, which I know people loved for the nostalgia, but they were not very accurate. It turns out, and we heard that there's going to be this program on Monday about the Bauer-Ginsburg report, that there's a looming crisis coming because a lot of the machines that were brought in to replace the machines are becoming outdated. And there really is going to be a crisis in voting technology, and it's something where we don't have the adequate resources. You know, after Bush versus Gore, the federal government coughed up a lot of money to buy machines, but now there's not money to do that. So things got a little better with the technology. Where things did not get better, we had 33 secretaries of state or chief election officers who were chosen in partisan elections in 2000 at the time of Bush versus Gore. We now have 32. The one that's changed is Florida, and it changed for the worse, because it went from being an elected official to someone who serves at the pleasure of the governor. And the governor fired someone who wouldn't do a voter purge that the governor wanted. So in terms of partisanship thing to rat, and also localism. So one of the things we learned about Florida was there were these bad felon voting lists that were sent out. But they had non-felons on the list that shouldn't have been on it, but they had felons on who should have been removed. And so one thing we learned was that local election officials in Florida, if they were Democrats, they were more likely to leave ineligible felons on the list. And if they were Republicans, they were more likely to remove eligible non-felons from the list. That is, we had localism and partisanship coming together, and that's still the story today. The big difference is now legislatures are getting involved in the act and passing statutes which either make it easier to vote in Democratic states or harder to vote in Republican states. And I should say, you're questioning the motive of conservatives. I would question the motives of Democrats too. Expanding the electorate helps Democrats. And so it's not surprising that Democrats want to expand the electorate.
Tanya, go ahead.
I don't know why it is questionable to want to expand the electorate. I don't know why that is conceived as something that should be challenged by whether or not you are a Democrat or even a Republican, you're an independent or Green Party candidate or purple person. It is not a partisan issue that people should be allowed to vote in this country. We're a democracy, and if we're talking about wanting to make sure our roads are paved correctly, making sure that we have adequate funding for our schools, making sure that we have the proper social services for those with mental illnesses, or making sure that we have so many of the services that are provided in our country, it's done by elected officials. And if you can't get to the ballot to vote, if you're being challenged in that regard in a way that is unnecessary and cumbersome, then why is it a problem, and why is it considered a partisan and somehow nefarious tactic by anyone to want to make sure that we have the most people that are allowed to vote, that are eligible and allowed to vote in this country? So putting that aside, I do think that we also need to be mindful of the fact that it's not just ID that we're talking about across the country, because there's a number of other issues that have come up, particularly since the 2010 election, after so many of the state legislatures changed. One of the things that the Lawyers Committee did do and was monitoring after the 2000 elections was this wave, and we called it our map of shame. And we continue to update it and currently have it on our website, and it just essentially shows the evolution of variety of voting restrictive laws that came about after 2010, after you had what you said, a lot of these legislatures that became all Republican, for the most part. That's what was happening. And you saw back to back. It wasn't just ID, it was restrictions on early voting, it was changes, this implementation, trying to create more proof of citizenship requirements. There was, the elimination of same-day voting. There was a lot of things that were taking place, and you couple that with the conversation and with the discussions that we hear in many of these state legislatures, you wonder, why is it that we are talking about people trying to stop people from voting? Why don't you just get your message out about what it is you want people to vote for and allow them to make their own choice at the ballot box? And frankly, what I believe is that people are just lazy. Parties become lazy, and they find it either, on one side, easier to stop people from voting versus to actually provide the necessary information for people to make their own choices when they get to the ballot box. And that's where you see a lot of the, I feel, politics coming into play with regard to how it is that many of these types of laws have been coupled and brought together, because it's an easier way for people to deal with the outcome that they want to see in the election versus actually providing the necessary resources to election administrators to resource the polling places, getting the proper notices out to people about what's happening on election day, getting the necessary literature out about what's, issues and where people stand. I think that is a lot also needs to be addressed as we talk about the barrage of voting legislation that we've seen happening across the country.
Roger, I'd ask you to respond to that, because we've talked a lot about ID and voter registration. We haven't talked, or I don't think you've had the opportunity to respond to the issue about the shrinking of early voting and the limitations on that, and that is, again, part of the Democratic bill of particulars against Republicans, that they're trying to limit the franchise. What's your view of that?
Well, again, I'm somewhat reluctant to generalize, because the question of the motives of the people involved and the question of whether a particular ballot security measure makes sense or not is going to vary a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I think that, having more and more days on which people can vote does, there are obviously going to be additional security problems, additional monitoring problems. There are also more sort of philosophical problems about, well, really shouldn't we all be voting on the same day to the extent possible? Do you really want somebody voting, you know, 2 months ahead of an election when things can change during those 2 months. So I would stress that to the extent that people are convinced that what's going on here is a deliberate attempt to disenfranchise someone, we have all kinds of legal mechanisms in place to keep that from happening and to make it possible to challenge laws or practices that are passed with bad motives. And I don't buy the argument that Shelby County somehow has made it open season on voters getting disenfranchised. Shelby County struck down one provision in the Voting Rights Act that had become obsolete. And the rest of the Voting Rights Act is alive and well and is being used very aggressively by the Justice Department and by a lot of civil rights groups, and is being used successfully. I don't always agree with the decisions that the courts have handed down, but it is simply not the case that it is impossible to bring and win cases challenging voter laws if somebody thinks that they were actually passed with discriminatory intent. A judge in Wisconsin ruled just that way within the last week. There have been other decisions like that. So, you know, I think that the mechanisms are out there, and I'm not going to say that it's always okay to get rid of early day voting, or that it's always wrong to get rid of it. I think that that's a question that can be answered differently by different jurisdictions, and if it's done legitimately, and if it's done illegitimately by some jurisdiction, there are mechanisms in place to challenge it.
Myrna, go ahead.
Yeah,
to go to questions from the audience.
Right, I wanted to just make sure that the audience was clear about a couple of things.
But hold the microphone.
I feel like I'm right in front of it, but I will try harder. Roger mentioned that that laws that were passed with bad motives were suspect, and he's right. He's right. They are under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Laws that were enacted with discriminatory intent are not permissible. But laws that also have a discriminatory effect are also not permissible, and that's a very important provision of the Voting Rights Act. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is what is the part that is left of the Voting Rights Act that has the most teeth. And one of the things that I think is very, very important for this audience to remember is the fact that we need a functioning Section 2, which means it needs to cover both discriminatory intent and discriminatory effect. And there are some folks in this country that would like for Section 2 to only be as coextensive as the 15th Amendment, which courts have interpreted as only covering discriminatory intent. We know that in this day and age, it is very difficult to prove intent. We know that people are smarter about what it is that they say, and what it is that they say in public, and what it is that they admit to, and that it's an incredible use of resources to actually have to try and go into what was in the hearts and minds behind the legislators that pass things. So when we are talking about challenging under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, it covers both discriminatory intent and it covers discriminatory effect, and it needs to do both of those things, or we're going to have an enormous gap in the jurisprudence of this country to be able to protect our right to vote.
Can I, one sentence, I'm
Let me just
sorry.
say,
You two, go ahead.
go ahead.
So I think Myrna was being polite. I just want to, Roger has written an article which basically would read, co-written with Hans von Spakovsky, which would basically read Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the part that's left, the part that he said we should rely on, even though Section 5 is gone, no big deal, we can rely on. He's written an article that says it should be read very narrowly, and if it's read broadly, it too is suspect as unconstitutional. So, you know, I think in Roger's world, we'd have very little protection for voters under the Voting Rights Act.
Okay,
I
well,
just think that should be out there.
Except talking to the mic.
I will. It is true that I think that Section 2 should be read narrowly in the way that I described in this piece that I wrote with Hans. That's not to say that it requires discriminatory intent to the same extent that the Constitution requires. But I will freely admit that I think that Section 2 should be amended so that it does, so that it is coextensive with the Constitution. And I think it is unconstitutional if it goes beyond that. And it is not true that you have to get inside the minds of legislators in order to show discriminatory intent, or that you can win these cases only if you can produce a smoking gun of somebody admitting why they're doing this. You can use circumstantial evidence. You can use statistical evidence. You can use all of this. I was in the Justice Department. We brought and won disparate treatment, intentional discrimination cases all the time. This is done in the voting area. It's done in lots of areas besides voting. All that's different is, all that's changed with the demise of Shelby, of Section 5, is that the plaintiffs have to come into court and prove their case, rather than being able to sit back and make objections and make the defendants come into court and prove not only that they didn't have discriminatory intent, but also that there is no disproportionate impact on the basis of race. That is a ridiculous approach to the law, and one that is outmoded.
So I have a comment on that before you go to it. Just briefly, that I think it's a big, we cannot summarily disregard the huge deterrent effect that Section 5 had upon states that were trying to enact discriminatory voting changes. And to simply be able to rely upon Section 2, and even as Roger and everybody acknowledges, you have to go into court. There is a huge burden. The burden is shifted. The burden is upon the plaintiff to come into court to provide.
And prove discrimination.
Well,
Yeah.
despite the fact that the states, despite the fact that there is a history of discrimination that is taking place in these states, and having just looked at the history of many of these states that we're often challenging under Section 2 right now, we're talking about over 10, up to 15 different objections, challenges that have been brought within the jurisdictions in the state as a result of discriminatory voting changes that are taking place.
3.
So I think that the problem that has ensued as a result of Shelby is huge, because we no longer have the deterrent effect to stop states that previously were attempting to pass laws that they knew were going to have either a discriminatory effect or intentionally attempting to prevent and block certain people from voting. We saw that occur immediately after Shelby, when you had states within hours moving to pass bills that they previously had objections to from the Department of Justice. We know, and we're looking at this across the board right now, that many states were just waiting at the door in order to move these pieces of legislation. And so it is huge. It's not simply to say, oh, I'm going to put that, it's not a big deal, we have Section 2. Yes, we know we have Section 2. Many of us are in the courts fighting. But these laws that we even talked about, a lot of the successes that we've achieved, Pennsylvania, that was, we're talking about years and years of litigation that could have been stopped within less than 6 months prior to election. We're talking about people's rights have already been disenfranchised. They've already lost that right to vote. And we're dealing with this after the fact as a result of Section 2, whereas Section 5 allowed us to prevent and stop laws from going into effect that would prevent people to be able to vote in the election.
Okay, I really am going to start and ask people. That woman had her hand up in the green shirt there, yeah. Just talk really loud. You have a microphone. Oh, you have a microphone. You don't have to talk loud.
Oh, I'll talk loud.
No. Just talk
Oh, thank you. I'll ignore the fact that my mother at 93 still wanted to vote in an assisted living home and said to me, this is a Northwestern graduate, by the way, whose father was a lawyer and brother was a judge.
You got to ask quickly.
And she said, how am I going to vote if I have to get a picture ID? Because you can't get me out of here so easy. I said, we'll work it out. We'll make sure you vote. that's your responsibility. That's number one. Number two, has anybody really seen early voting? I did in Skokie. This was the most incredibly wonderful sight. In Skokie, it's a very multinational group, okay? And families walked in on Saturday mornings because they could get there with their kids. Families from countries all over the world. I got to ask a question. How can we keep early voting going for seniors, people from other countries who can bring their families with kids went with them, and make this the way it should be in America?
Okay. No, but I think the question is, like, isn't early voting an opportunity that we should give people? Roger.
I think that properly supervised early voting is an opportunity that ought to be available to some people. But I think that there are also ballot integrity issues that can arise if it's not carefully supervised. And again, I don't see anything wrong with trying to get as many eligible voters who want to vote voting as possible. But I also don't see anything wrong with wanting to make sure that people who aren't eligible don't vote, or who are eligible don't vote more than once. And it's just a matter of coming up with measures that do that.
That fellow right there in the glasses. Wait for the microphone. Doesn't appear to be on.
Address to Mr. Clegg. When you talk about having an intent standard to prove a voting rights case, you have an example like the state of Texas, which says, in the case that's presently going on, we weren't targeting minority voters, we were targeting Democrat voters. Now it just so happens, that Democrat voters are overwhelmingly minority, and they're the ones who are going to be hurt by this. I mean, that admission, I think if there's a predictable effect from an action like that, that's an intent to discriminate. I think it might be helpful, and maybe the rest of the panel can talk about this, whether analyzing this sort of case as a mixed motive case, as exists in Title VII law, might be helpful, because it says you can have target Democrats, but that can still be discrimination. I like your reaction to that.
I agree with, I think, most of what you said. I think that if you have a discriminatory, if discrimination is part of your motive, I think that then the burden shifts to the other side. You know, I don't know if you're a lawyer or not, but that's the way that it works. And the other side then has to prove that, well, this bill would have passed anyway without the discriminatory motive, which is a difficult standard to bear. And I also agree with you that part of what you can use to show intent is the predictable outcome, you know, on a particular minority group of a particular measure. I mean, this is one reason why I think that it is wrong to say that the discriminatory intent standard is one that's impossible to meet. This is something that the Supreme Court made clear in the 1970s. I mean, it listed in Arlington Heights and Washington versus Davis that there are all kinds of things that you can look at in order to show evidence of discriminatory motive. You don't have to have you know, a smoking gun. You can look at the statistics. You can look at the outcome. You can look at all those things.
Let me just follow up on that and let you, but because this is a point I think of interesting, I hope, clarification. The Supreme Court has said it's perfectly fine when you're drawing district lines, to have a partisan motive. You know, you want to help the party in power, no doubt about it. Is it permissible when you are drawing up voting rules, voter ID, polling time when it's open, can you have a partisan motive in that as well?
I'm glad you asked that.
Well, I'm glad you're glad.
What Texas said, when Texas made those comments in relation to their redistricting, not in relation to their voter ID law.
That's what I thought, yeah.
There was a guy on The Daily Show who was a local North Carolina election official who said, we passed this voter ID law to make it harder for Democrats, also to make it harder for blacks. But there's no state legislature smoking gun like that. So there's a question of whether you're allowed to discriminate on the basis of party when it comes to redistricting, because the Supreme Court says we don't know when taking party into account is legitimate and when it's not. We can't draw the lines. The question of whether that translates into the issue of election administration, the Supreme Court's never said. And I argue, actually I have a piece called Race or Party in the Harvard Law Review Forum where I say the court should not allow that. And if the motivation is partisan, then that should make it subject to a higher level of scrutiny. But the court has not addressed that.
Sir, you've had your hand up. Wait for the microphone and ask a question.
Thank you. Professor Hassan, this is actually just on that last topic. I know that California has instituted citizen panels to determine districts instead of having politically oriented ones. Do you think that has a meaningful difference on actual voting impact? I've heard that the districts they lined up were very, very similar to the ones that were made in the more political process.
He asked you, but I'm happy to take it.
Go ahead.
The thing that was really telling about the Citizens Commission is that the prior redistricting section.
I'm sorry, you need to get even closer.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
It's the first time I've ever been told I'm not loud enough. The prior redistricting cycles had been, by all accounts, sweetheart deals, where the Democrats said, we're going to get our districts here, the Republicans said, we are going to get our districts there, and the idea of the Citizens Commission was to not have that process function that way. And there are a number of metrics by which one could judge the Citizen Commission. One thing I do think is important is that we should decide how it is that we want our district lines to be drawn as a country. Do we want them to be drawn by citizen commissions? Do we want them to be drawn by legislators? Do we want them to be drawn by technocrats? Do we want them to be drawn by experts, which is sometimes what happens when you have citizens commissions do them? And I think the question to ask is, like, when you're looking at redistricting, what is the metric that you want? If the metric is competitiveness, then different redistricting schemes are going to fare better on that. And the thing about redistricting is that you cannot optimize all of the important values that you want in redistricting. By definition, it is zero sum because you draw a line this way or you draw a line that way. This group is going to be in it, that group is going to be out of it. And I think the question of redistricting becomes really difficult in the public sphere because there's not an agreement upon what it is those values that we want. Is the most important value compact districts? Is the most important value community of interest? Is the most important value competition? Is the most important value protecting incumbents? Is the most important value contiguity? There's a bazillion number of them that are recognized under state and federal law as being permissible, but in the end, someone's going to have to make a call as to which ones you're going to elevate when they become conflicting. And so for those that study this, for those that are interested in studying this, I think the first place to look is, what are your values when you're redistricting? What do you think is most important? And when two of those values collide, how are you going to make the decision and which one are you going to prioritize?
That woman over there, you wait for the microphone.
Right. Okay. Thank you all for being here. I feel like I know a lot more on this topic now than I did when I walked in, so thank you.
Different from cable TV in that regard.
Here in Chicago, they say that dead people have been voting for a long time. I don't know what the terms are. Is this situation the same as impersonation fraud? If it is or if it's not, would photo ID laws address this kind of situation? And how would that be addressed by the suggestions that Myrna had about changing the elected officials?
The term for dead people is ineligible to vote. But anybody want to take that on, the dead people issue? I mean,
It's quick, and then you can
Sure.
add it. I mean,
I know that we have cases of that recorded, but you mentioned that there were no cases.
well, first of all, is that mythology, or is there any evidence that that's
it's
true?
Not a,
I think we have some Chicago folks here who can. Yeah,
yeah.
mostly meth, they say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is about failure to properly clean the voting rolls. People being left on the voting rolls, and they're showing up. Not the people showing up, but I mean, their names are on the list, all right? So nobody's at, so it's not about, this is, you don't have, so that's the actual issue. It's about cleaning our our voter rolls, and that can be done under proper purges. But a lot of times, the problem is that election officials are either not doing it properly, number two, doing it too close to an election, and therefore not necessarily verifying that the information that they have is accurate. And so what Myrna was speaking about is true in terms of the necessary, if we provide the proper resources to election officials, we can cure a lot of these problems, but we still need to maintain compliance with our current voting laws. For example, the National Voter Registration Act is what actually oversees the compliance of the cleaning of our voting rolls. So when you talk about the purges, that's where there's certain parameters that you have to follow. And so I can't speak to Chicago, your issue, because I don't know all about Chicago, but when I hear about the dead people voting, I think it's pretty much an urban myth, but what we're talking about a lot of times is, inaccurate cleaning of the voting rolls, and so therefore you have people who are not, you have people whose names are still on the list.
And this gentleman right here, we're going to have a couple more. I'm so glad.
Thank you all very much. If I can bring it back to Shelby Holder, Justice Roberts' opinion and the decision was to strike 4B, which was the formula. 5 still stands. They've never addressed 5, not in Northwest Austin, not in Katzenbach, which was a comical case, if I'm injecting my opinion. But comical in that it came like the year after it was passed. Like, you want to go ahead and... No, the idea of the case. No, but that... the issue is that it's not an issue of the courts, it's an issue of Congress has to pass a new formula, and that there's no political will to go out and pass a new formula to put in where 4B was taken out. 2 and 5 are still there, and if you put a new formula in there, that'll fix the problem. I think that has come up post Shelby Holder. But to me, it seems like it's an issue of political will and not so much one of, the courts getting the decision wrong, because I think that Justice Roberts was right in saying that it was an antiquated formula.
So what do you think about that? I mean, that Congress could update the formula, but as far as I can tell, Congress has no intention of doing it. So what does that mean? I mean, does that mean Section 4 and 5 are dead for essentially ever?
So,
I hope so.
You hope.
I hope so. And the reason is that, I think the way that the gentleman described Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts' opinion was correct. And what we have now is, the coverage formula has been struck down. And the question is, are there any jurisdictions now, in 2014, that are like 1965 Mississippi? And the answer is no, there are not. And if there were, you have the rest of the Voting Rights Act to go after them, including Section 3, which would allow a preclearance provision to be put in there. So Congress should not, well, look, if you think that there are, that the extent of racial discrimination in voting in 2014 is anywhere near what it was like in 1965, you are delusional, sir.
This is the best panel I've ever moderated. This is so great. No. All right, hold on. Wait a second. Wait. I know. Wait. All right, hold on. We're gonna. All right, wait. No.
You won't let us talk to discuss it.
Well, we're gonna. Hold on. 1 sec. No, you're gonna talk. 1 second. This gentleman now.
Yes, I arrived an hour early, having voted the first time for John F. Kennedy, and I thought tonight's conversation was appropriate for a university such as the University of Chicago. However, I really would have loved to have heard the erudite panel address the real issue, and that is the declining voter registration and voter turnout. And to think of how minutely you went into looking for voter impersonation, checking with district attorneys across the country. If we could turn the collective wisdom of those on this panel towards the real issue of getting people registered and getting them to the polls, sincerely, whichever way they vote, Roger, seriously, I would really like to see those matters addressed as a citizen that believes we do need to hear everybody's vote on election day. And
All right,
Can
I just, I just would like to say what a great question that is. And also, if whoever chooses to answer it could tell us, just as a factual matter, what % of eligible people in the United States vote in a presidential election, in an off-year election, just so we know just what we're talking about here. And whoever knows the answer to that, but I really appreciate that question.
You're talking about 50% of registered voters, which is a much smaller percentage of eligible voters. But I should point out, I want universal voter registration. I want the federal government to go out to every person in the country and register them and give them a national voter ID card and let them use their thumbprint. So if they forget their card, they remember their thumb.
Okay. Go ahead.
I think the problem of voter registration is an incredibly significant problem, and I think it's a way that we can address with a lot of different ways, including the use of technology. We know where people live, we know what government agencies they use, and I think we spend too much of our effort relying on antiquated paper. Like, why is it that when you go into a registration office, you have to fill out a piece of paper, that paper needs to get collated, it needs to get mailed to someone else has to type it in. These computers can talk to each other. And I think we need to use those kinds of things to make the process more streamlined from the voter's perspective, such that it happens seamlessly, and we do need to have the government decide that it's their onus to go and actively look for people in order to register.
But if I can just follow up, yes, that's true, and I think the process needs, I think we can all agree the process can be better. But why don't more people want to vote? I mean, why don't more people want?
Some people do want to vote, they're not registered to vote.
Well,
Okay.
can I
I'm sorry,
speak?
Tanya?
I think that we do have a problem today, the fact that we are not encouraging the next generation to be civically minded. This gets to the issue of education. We don't teach civics in classes anymore. We don't have, if you all remember, what is it, Schoolhouse Rock? That was how I initially, learned about certain things as a child. But there's a lot of problems within our education system in terms of trying to, I think, talk to our youth and talk to our next generation about the importance of voting. That has been lost a lot. I think that the difficulties that were encountered during the civil rights era, many of us, not me, but previous generations remember that, but it's not often being handed down and reminded about what was fought for. So I think the problem of voter turnout is real, and you're right that it continues to exist, and it's going to happen if we don't, as a community, start going back and reminding people about the importance of our democratic process generally. Now, I just want to briefly mention this issue about voter registration, a couple of things. Number one, I think it is extremely important that we encourage the overhaul of voter registration system, because it actually would fix a lot of the issues that we've been talking about today. We would even get beyond the misrepresentations that we hear on both sides about voter fraud, or ID, whatever, because we know that the majority of issues could be fixed if people were properly registered and didn't have to deal with a lot of these issues on election day. Now, we, through Election Protection, which is kind of a coalition organized with the Lawyers Committee, Brennan Center, ACL, a lot of the organizations that are out there trying to protect the right to vote, we're out there prior to election, on election day, trying to make sure that if people have problems, they can call a hotline and find out how they can get assistance. The majority of our calls are about voter registration. The majority. It's not, obviously we have a lot of other calls coming in, but the majority could be fixed by voter registration. Something went wrong They didn't get their voter registration card, so therefore they're on a separate list that nobody knew about. It's the secret list about inactive voters because they weren't properly registered. And so now people don't know to look for that, and then they're being directed to vote by provisional ballot, which then, if they don't go back within, depending on the state, within a few days, in order to bring a certain type of identification, their vote's not going to be counted as a result of the Help America Vote Act or other laws that have been passed in the state. And so you have a lot of these issues that are taking place, and a lot of it's the cause of voter registration. So I just wanted to put that information out there because it's not like in the past, like this stuff is currently, continues to happen. And then lastly, I have to address this issue of the fact, and Myrna touched upon this, that we don't have to have the blatant forms of voter discrimination that existed in 1965 in order to recognize that we still have discrimination that's happening across this country. It happens in multiple forms. And people have become much more nefarious about their tactics. We have deceptive practices that are happening across the country. We deal with this through election protection. We deal with billboards that go up that tell people that it's a crime for them to vote on, and they're put up in certain communities. We have calls that are being made telling people the wrong day to vote. We have calls being made telling them you're such a great voter you can vote by phone. We have people being told misinformation about candidates. All of these things are still happening. Some of this wasn't the issue that we were facing in 1965, but it still has the same effect. It disenfranchises people. So therefore, the fact of the matter is that even if we don't have the same types of voter discrimination that was happening back in 1965, we still have a host of other things that are happening that still need to have been documented, and we have it for the record. We've been collecting this information through the Voting Rights Commission for the past year in order to supplement the record on the Voting Rights Act amendment. And we've got documentation. We had it even back in 2006 when we did the initial reauthorization. We have volumes of material. And so it may be different from what it is we had in 65, but it's not, it has the similar effect of disenfranchising voters. So I think that you have to set, I want to make sure that you are clear that you need to find out for yourself about what actually exists in the record, and not take for granted to say that, because it didn't look like 1965, therefore, we no longer need certain laws in order to ensure that we have the right to vote. Heck, we don't have, you're right, we don't have literacy taxes, literacy tests right now. Does that mean that it's still not nefarious to have people and have deceptive tactics out there and people telling the wrong day to vote, that that's not similarly disenfranchising? I mean, that is something, exactly. So there's so many things that are out there that we can't disregard that justify the continued need for Section 5 and a new coverage formula that Congress does have the responsibility to pass, and I'm hoping that before we end, we can talk about that bill that y'all need.
I think Steve is giving us the hook. Well, I'll hang around. We got to go, right? I mean, that's.
Yeah, you can each wrap up with a closing comment if you would like, just to make sure there's nothing left here. But I realize we're coming up on our time here.
I have no closing comments. So that'll be fast.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's close with just a final comment from everybody, and then we'll wrap.
Final thought. Why don't we go, Rick, and we'll work down. Hold. Rick, go ahead.
I guess the positive thing is that people are engaged in this topic, and it's the best thing to do is to become educated for yourself. There's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of exaggeration, and hopefully this is a small step today in moving things forward.
I love to vote. I love that we have the right to vote. I love being a voting lawyer. I love representing voters. And I love the fact that there are people as engaged to be here on an evening. And I would hope that you remember that there's always a place for voters in this process, not just on Election Day. There are candidates that you can support. There are election administrators you can volunteer for. There are nonprofit organizations that would love your talent and your time. There's lots of ways to be involved. And I do believe that voting is is one of those things that brings us together as Americans. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It's one of the ways that we say this is how we care about our community, this is how we care about our country, and we should all go out and do that and take our right to vote very seriously.
I agree with all that. Again, I think that it's important for people who are eligible to vote, that they not be discouraged from voting. But I also think it's important to make sure that people don't vote when they're not eligible to vote, and that they not vote more than once. And I believe that both of those sentiments are good sentiments. I also think that mechanisms like Section 5 are not needed anymore. A lot of the things that were being listed are not things that would have been pre-cleared. Nobody would have been kept from misinforming people about the date of an election by Section 5. Those are things that are wrong, that should be prosecuted, but you don't need Section 5 to do them. And finally, as a conservative and as a fan of Edmund Burke, I'm not sure there's such a terrible thing if dead people can vote.
Right. On that note,
wrap it up.
Please join me in thanking our outstanding panelists and our terrific moderator. This is not meant to be the end of the conversation. It's not meant to be the definitive conversation. Our goal here is to expand and elevate. I think our panel has done just that. I want to put in one final plug for our election administration symposium on Monday, which goes right at the heart of many of the issues that were brought up tonight. I encourage you also to come to future events. politics.uchicago.edu is our URL. Thank you all very much for being here. Have a great evening.